You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, this is Matt and McKinley from History Dispatches.
We are the father-son duo bringing you the weird, the wild, the wacky, and the craziest tales from across time.
From the Ice Bowl
to the Great Heathen Army.
And the head of Oliver Cromwell.
The same head they kept on a pike for 3 years?
Yep, all here on History Dispatches.
New episodes every weekday.
Find out more at historydispatches.com or wherever you get your podcast app.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 491 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, in what has really been one big continuing story arc encompassing events in Virginia in the spring of 1864, so far we've covered the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and also the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy.
In war, when embarking on a course of action, a good commander will contemplate many contingencies or possibilities and how he'll react to them. And Ulysses S. Grant had contemplated the possibility of making another slide around Robert E.'s flank days before it became necessary to do so. And therefore he could respond immediately to the news that Sigel had been defeated out in the Shenandoah Valley, and Butler had allowed himself to be bottled up down in Bermuda Hundred.
Grant knew those failures in other parts of Virginia would result in Confederate forces being freed up and sent as reinforcements to Lee's army at Spotsylvania. But he met the new situation with the calm resolve for which he was famous. Colonel Horace Porter, an officer on Grant's staff, noted, quote, "The general is not a man to waste any time over occurrences of the past. His first thoughts were always to redouble his efforts to take the initiative and overcome disaster by success."
Porter recalled that Grant's reaction to the unwelcome news about Sigel and Butler was to sit down at once and write out an order for the Army of the Potomac to leave Spotsylvania, since there was nothing further to be gained there if Lee was about to be reinforced. And Grant's orders called for the movement to begin the very next day.
Certain aspects of the movement were obvious. For example, the lack of a viable supply line west of Spotsylvania meant the Army of the Potomac would once again swing to the southeast, around Lee's right flank. However, such a maneuver would uncover the roads that led back to the Army's supply base at Belle Plaine. That meant a new base would have to be established farther south.
And Port Royal, a sleepy tobacco port on the lower Rappahannock River, answered the purpose. And so Grant told Henry Halleck he wanted future shipments of supplies and reinforcements to be sent there. But supply was not the main problem. Rather, it was how to destroy Lee's army, or, as Grant preferred to think, how to complete its destruction.
Confronted by a new turning movement by the Yankees, Lee could easily fall back a few miles to the North Anna River, which was an obvious defensive position. Lee could even withdraw further and put his army into Richmond's fortifications.
Either way, Lee would confront Grant from a position just as formidable as the one the rebels had occupied at Spotsylvania. So Grant knew the Army of the Potomac needed to fight the Army of Northern Virginia in open country, where it would be possible to smash the enemy. The question was, how to do that? Since Grant couldn't force Lee to accept battle in the open, he would have to encourage Lee to do so of his own accord. And that meant he would have to offer Lee a reason to take the offensive.
In other words, Grant would have to offer Lee a tempting prize, one that was worth the risk of the rebel army sticking its neck out and fighting in the open field, outside of defensive works. And the prize was obvious. If Grant wanted an opportunity to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, he would have to first present Lee with the chance to destroy the Army of the Potomac.
To tempt Robert E. Lee into making a mistake, Ulysses S. Grant decided to use Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps as bait. To that end, rather than make the turning movement around the Confederate right with the entire army, Grant decided to use only Second Corps. For the moment, the rest of the Army of the Potomac would remain at Spotsylvania. Lee would detect Hancock's move, and if he were as aggressive as advertised, he'd strike at Second Corps.
Then, once Lee had committed himself to the attack, Grant would sweep down suddenly and destroy the Confederate Army before it could do serious harm to Second Corps. It was a risky gamble, but Grant believed it offered the only chance to beat the rebels in the open field. His biggest worry was that Lee wouldn't take the bait.
But Grant received an encouraging sign on May 19th, the day Hancock was slated to begin the movement around Lee's flank. Federal troops spent the day shifting to new positions, abandoning their west to east orientation and taking up a new line that ran past Spotsylvania Courthouse on a north to south axis, with 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps holding down the fort, so to speak, while Hancock's Second Corps assembled in the rear. Well, morning and noon passed without incident, but at 4:30 that afternoon, a large Confederate force suddenly appeared on the Federal right flank. The explosion of musketry from that direction was all the evidence Grant needed that Robert E. Lee remained as aggressive as ever.
The fighting in the Federal right flank was located near the Harris Farm, not far from the main road leading down to Spotsylvania from Fredericksburg. If the rebels seized the road, it would jeopardize the Army of the Potomac's most direct link with its Belle Plaine supply base.
As always, when Lee did something combative, George Meade reacted defensively. Here, he sent instructions to Hancock to, quote, "Move up a division and double quick. The enemy have attacked us in force at the Harris House. The rest of your corps to follow." Well, that order effectively postponed Hancock's planned turning movement, which was slated to begin that evening. But to Meade, it was more important to use Second Corps here to shore up the threatened Federal flank.
When the Confederate attack began, Horace Porter, the colonel on Grant's staff, was napping at headquarters. A black camp servant shook Porter awake, and after he'd emerged from his tent, Grant told him, "The enemy is detaching a large force on our right. I wish you would ride to the point of attack and keep me posted as to the movement, and urge the commanders of the troops in that vicinity not only to check the advance of the enemy, but to take the offensive and destroy them if possible. You can say that Warren's corps will be ordered to cooperate promptly."
Porter galloped off and soon located Brigadier General Robert Tyler, a friend from the pre-war Army who commanded a fresh division just arrived from Washington. The division was the most unusual formation in the Army of the Potomac. Though temporarily designated a division, it had no brigade structure and wasn't composed of infantry. Instead, it was made up of 5 big regiments of heavy artillery, oversized units averaging 1,500 men apiece, created and trained to man the large cannon in the forts that ringed Washington, D.C.
Since no Confederates had ever attacked Washington, the artillerists had spent their service in the war thus far training on their guns and holding parades. Then Grant issued an order converting them to infantry and adding them to the Army of the Potomac.
Most of the troops had more than 2 years' service under their belts, so they were well trained, but this would be their first taste of battle. Upon joining the Army of the Potomac, the former heavy artillerists took a lot of heat from genuine infantrymen and even from their counterparts in the field artillery. As a member of a New York battery explained, quote, "There was a widespread belief among us that these men had enlisted in that arm because they expected to fight behind earthworks or safely garrison the forts which surrounded Washington."
But once in line of battle, the heavies stood the test of combat well, and when Porter rode up from Grant's headquarters, he could see them gamely standing and delivering volleys. Porter told his old friend Tyler, "You're in luck today. It isn't everyone who has a chance to make such a debut on joining the Army. You were certain to knock a brevet out of this day's fight."
Talk of a promotion no doubt pleased Tyler, and he replied, "Well, as you can see, my men are raw hands at this sort of work, but they are behaving like veterans." The Confederates assailing the heavies belonged to Ewell's Corps, and contrary to what the Federals at first believed, they were not intent on crushing the Federal right. They simply wanted to ascertain the location of the new Union flank, since, remember, most of the Army of the Potomac was shifting into that new north-to-south line. And so Robert E. Lee's instructions to Dick Ewell had called for a reconnaissance, not a full-blown assault. But nevertheless, Ewell tapped his entire corps for the mission, apparently on the theory that a large force could hold its own should it encounter serious trouble.
Even using everyone, Ewell had barely 6,000 men to find out just where the Yankee Army's new right flank was located. The Confederates left their entrenchments around 2:30 on the afternoon of May 19th and detoured cautiously around the previously held Federal lines before heading east toward the Fredericksburg Road.
Near the Harris farm, the rebels suddenly encountered Tyler's Federals and 2 additional heavy artillery regiments under Colonel J. Howard Kitching, reinforced by an additional battalion of heavies. The commander of the leading Confederate brigade, Brigadier General Stephen Ramseur, erroneously concluded the Federals were about to charge, so he launched a spoiler attack to throw the Yankees off balance. And soon, most of Ewell's corps became engaged, and a 3-hour fight ensued amidst a drenching downpour.
Some rebels briefly broke through and found themselves in the middle of a Federal wagon train, but they had time only to shoot a few horses and mules before being forced back. For the most part, the Confederates had their hands full just dealing with Tyler's unexpectedly combative heavies. To be sure, the heavies showed their inexperience, but nonetheless they were willing to fight. One veteran officer declared they, quote, "got a little mixed and didn't fight very tactically, but they fought confounded plucky."
In the end, Ewell's Confederates withdrew, having lost 900 casualties as the price for locating the Union right. On the Federal side, in the clash at the Harris farm, the heavies lost some 1,500 men of their own, but their willingness to stand and go toe-to-toe with the Confederates earned them the respect of the rest of the army.
The fighting at the Harris farm on May 19th not only saw the heavies earn the respect of the rest of the Army of the Potomac, but it gave Ulysses S. Grant a new reason to believe that Hancock's turning movement might succeed.
The next morning, Grant told his staff, quote, "My chief anxiety now is to draw Lee out of his works and fight him in the open field instead of assaulting him behind his entrenchments. The movement of Ewell yesterday gives me some hope that Lee may at times take the offensive and thus give our troops the desired opportunity."
Hancock's Second Corps finally began the delayed turning movement after dark on the evening of May 20th, marching eastward and picking up a cavalry brigade as escort, then continuing on to Guinea Station on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad.
There, the Union horsemen drove away a small picket of Confederate cavalry and turned south down the railroad tracks. Hancock's infantry followed them. By 9 o'clock on the morning of May 21st, the Federal cavalry had reached Milford Station, about 17 miles southeast of Spotsylvania. Around noon, Hancock's lead division passed through nearby Bowling Green, crossed the Mattaponi River, and halted.
Hancock had now fulfilled his instructions. As his orders directed, he'd reached the right bank of the river, a position from which his corps could threaten Lee's line of communications. The threat, to be sure, was as yet more potential than real. Confederate communications were still intact, and Lee, if he chose, could easily withdraw to a new position behind the North Anna.
However, Grant was hoping that instead Lee would take the bait and go after the seemingly isolated and vulnerable Second Corps, which was now about 20 miles away from the rest of the Army of the Potomac. Hancock briefly considered continuing his movement to make himself even more of a threat to the Confederate line of communications, but in the end, he decided against it. Not only was he about 20 miles away from help, but rebel prisoners captured in a sharp mid-morning skirmish at Milford Station proved to belong not to Lee's army at Spotsylvania, but to units of Pickett's division, which had previously been serving elsewhere.
Their presence here signaled the arrival of the first reinforcements to Lee's army, made possible by the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy. That being the case, Hancock realized that if he pushed ahead even further, there was a chance he might run into more Confederates than Second Corps could handle alone, so he decided to fortify his present position and await developments.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
According to the logic of Grant's original plan, Robert E. Lee would now see Second Corps as not only a threat, but also as isolated and vulnerable, which would entice him to leave his entrenchments at Spotsylvania and attack Hancock.
But Lee failed to take the bait. In fact, he failed to even recognize it as bait.
Viewing Hancock as neither an imminent threat nor an inviting target, Lee assumed that Second Corps' advance to the Mattaponi was merely the first stage of a general movement by the Army of the Potomac. You see, Lee had been expecting that sooner or later Grant would try to get around his right flank, and now it appeared Grant was doing just that.
In response, Lee decided to have the Army of Northern Virginia pull back to the North Anna River. So, for the next 36 hours, the two armies marched along roughly parallel routes. The Army of the Potomac followed Second Corps, moving generally southeast from Spotsylvania to Guinea Station, then to Milford Station and the neighboring village of Bowling Green.
Meanwhile, the Confederates headed directly for the North Anna River, about halfway between Spotsylvania and Richmond. Union and Confederate cavalry scouts kept an eye on what the respective enemy was doing, but otherwise the two armies were out of contact for the first time since May 5th.
The armies had also left Spotsylvania County, the scene of four of the Eastern Theater's fiercest battles, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, as well as the recent fighting in the Wilderness and around Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now the two armies were entering Caroline County, which so far had scarcely been touched by the war and was one of the wealthiest counties in the region, with large numbers of slaves and rich in crops and livestock.
Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana reported to his boss, Edwin Stanton, that although most of the slaves and much of the cattle had been removed as the armies approached, still it was, quote, fine, clear country. And a federal artilleryman deemed it, quote, the best agricultural region I had seen in Virginia. And so, what happened next was predictable. At every opportunity, Union soldiers left the ranks and plundered Caroline County's livestock and crops. Now, by 1864, such unauthorized foraging, marauding was the term officially used, but it had become an old story, particularly in the Western theater, where, as we've discussed on the podcast, as the war dragged on, foraging or pillaging or marauding was seen as an entirely justified act of war, since it removed or destroyed resources that could be used to sustain the Confederate war effort, and it also weakened support for the rebellion by eroding the morale of Southern civilians.
In the Eastern Theater, there were varied reactions among the Army of the Potomac's officer corps. Some officers were outraged. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. wrote in his diary on May 23rd that, quote, straggling and marauding have become a great evil. Families are robbed and houses burned constantly by ruffians.
One of Meade's staff officers noted, quote, some of the generals, particularly Birney and Barlow, have punished pillagers in a way they will not soon forget, and they will be shot if they do not stop outrages on the inhabitants.
Other officers saw it as unfortunate but inevitable. Along 5th Corps' line of march, Brigadier General Joseph Bartlett, when he came upon a vast expanse of sheep carcasses, shrugged and commented, if sheep attack you, you are obliged to fight.
And the Army's Provost Marshal, Marcena Patrick, confided to his diary that he believed that Grant's staff were, quote, themselves engaged in sheep stealing, fowl stealing, and the like. I am very tired and feel very despondent about Grant's notions of discipline, end quote. But in fact, while Ulysses S. Grant explicitly approved of foraging, if done by proper authority, he was anything but indifferent to this outbreak of unauthorized pillaging, less because of its effect on the area's civilians than its impact on military discipline and efficiency. For that reason, orders went out for a full regiment to march at the rear of each corps, with instructions to deal out immediate punishment on anyone found straggling from the ranks, quote, especially those who may be found going to farmhouses for the purpose of pillaging.
Grant was so concerned about the rash of thievery because he knew the breakdown in discipline and absence from the ranks, if not nipped in the bud, would weaken the Army even as he maneuvered it so as to once again strike at Robert E. Lee, who, scouts reported, was taking up a new defensive position behind the North Anna River along the southern border of Caroline County.
The North Anna River had its source out near Orange Courthouse, and about 20 miles north of Richmond, it bisected the Telegraph Road, the main highway between Washington and the Confederate capital. It then turned sharply south, and after about 4 miles as the crow flies, its waters combined with those of the South Anna to form the Pamunkey River.
Sandwiched between the North and South Anna lay Hanover Junction, a small settlement where the Virginia Central and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac railroads intersected. The latter line was of little consequence to Robert E. Lee, but the Virginia Central constituted his main link with the foodstuffs in the Shenandoah Valley.
Because of that, Lee needed to hold on to Hanover Junction if at all possible, and the North Anna provided a useful shield since it was 150 feet across, steep banked, and crossable only at a few points. But as a defensive line, it had one glaring defect. Its northern bank was generally higher than its southern bank, which meant Federal artillery would be able to command most of the crossing points. That meant a close-up defense of the river would be difficult for the Confederates. Nevertheless, Grant's options for crossing were limited to a handful of bridges and fords, and it would require several hours for a Federal corps to cross from one side to the other. So, all in all, from Lee's perspective, the river wasn't a perfect spot to set up shop long term, but it would do for now.
Lee didn't expect to fight along the North Anna anyway, at least not for several days. On May 22nd, as his 3 infantry corps converged on Hanover Junction, Lee penned a letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, explaining the situation as he saw it. The enemy, he wrote, had left Spotsylvania and seemed to be attempting, quote, by rapid movements to join his cavalry under Sheridan to attack Richmond.
To guard against that possibility, Lee had chosen to withdraw southward to the North Anna, telling Davis, quote, I should have preferred contesting the enemy's approach inch by inch, but my concern for Richmond caused me to abandon that plan, end quote. Lee assumed that Grant, having left Spotsylvania, would now do one of two things. He might continue his swing to the southeast and cross the Pamunkey River, which would enable him to approach Richmond from the east while using either the Pamunkey or the York River for supplies. Or Grant might advance directly south toward Richmond, using the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad as his supply line.
However, if Grant did the latter, he'd have to rebuild the railroad, and Lee speculated that his opponent would actually welcome that delay. Lee told Davis, quote, during its reconstruction, General Grant will have time to reorganize his army, which, as far as I am able to judge, has been very much shaken.
And Lee's adjutant echoed his chief's assessment. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Taylor, in a letter to his wife, told her that despite the Army of Northern Virginia's withdrawal to the North Anna, quote, this does not look like a retreat. Our army is in excellent condition, as good as it was when we met Grant 2 weeks since. His losses have already been fearfully large. Our list of casualties is a sad one to contemplate, but does not compare with his terrible record of killed and wounded.
Like Robert E. Lee, Taylor didn't expect a battle along the North Anna either. He told his wife, I think it probable he will make still another move to the right and land somewhere near West Point. Taylor said this because West Point on the York River lay within a few miles of White House Landing, which was the place George McClellan had used as his own supply base during his campaign against Richmond back in the summer of 1862.
Taylor supposed Grant was following the same strategy, but such thoughts were based on the assumption that Grant's objective, like Little Mac's, was Richmond itself. Neither Robert E. Lee nor Walter Taylor nor any other Confederate appreciated that Ulysses S. Grant's actual goal was the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederates misread Grant's intentions, despite the fact that Lee's own goal was the destruction of the Army of the Potomac. Well, in any event, as he contemplated the situation from his new headquarters at Hanover Junction, Robert E. Lee believed his chances of striking such a blow against the Yankees were getting better. Because, by all accounts, Grant's army was much depleted by its heavy losses in the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania, and it was losing thousands of veterans whose enlistments had expired. In addition, Grant's line of communication and supply was becoming longer with every mile south he advanced.
The Army of Northern Virginia's situation was just the reverse. It had lost fewer men, its supply line back to Richmond had grown shorter and was less vulnerable, and as it reached Hanover Junction, it had been reinforced by over 10,000 soldiers from the Shenandoah Valley and Bermuda Hundred.
Even better, only 40 miles now separated Lee's army and Beauregard's forces, and with 2 railroads linking Hanover Junction and Richmond, a concentration of all available Confederate forces in the region could quickly be made. So, on May 23rd, Lee wrote to Davis, saying, "It seems to me our best policy is to unite upon Grant's army and endeavor to crush it. I should be very glad to have the aid of General Beauregard in such a blow, and if it is possible to combine, I think it will succeed." Well, and that's where we'll leave things for right now, having set the stage for the next act in our story arc. And next time, we'll see that Robert E. Lee's reading of the situation was optimistic, but not realistic. And we'll also see that, not surprisingly, Ulysses S. Grant viewed the state of affairs very differently.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is To the North Anna River, Grant and Lee, May 13th through 25th, 1864, by Gordon C. Ray.
This is another volume in Gordon C. Ray's series about the epic struggle between Grant and Lee in the spring of 1864, and it's just as good as the others we've recommended so far, the books on the wilderness and Spotsylvania. And really, as a body of work, all of his books on these battles deserve to be on your Civil War bookshelf, and we can't recommend them highly enough.
Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Joy M. and Chad G. have done recently.
A big thank you to them, and also to Renee P. for their donation.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.